I'm Shawn Mihalik, and I'm the author of the novella The Flute Player. The Flute Player is a young adult-ish novella about a young man named Oliver who inherited the position of the flute player of the village of Drommar when he was very, very young, because the previous flute player, his best friend, died during a tragic childhood accident. Aside from that, it's about dragons and a naked man wearing a cummerbund, Volkswagen Beetles, music. It's also about loss and tragedy and death and growth and personal discovery. Oliver meets a mysterious young woman who comes from a world that is completely outside his own, and through meeting her and getting to know her, he starts to learn some very important things about himself and the nature of his world and his job as the flute player. Well, without giving too much away, the flute player takes place in a sort of fantastical village that's in a world completely separate from our own. The village is the only thing there. You've got the village, and then around the village is this sort of mysterious set of woods, and then around that is this great ocean that nobody has ever gone beyond, and then right beyond the ocean are these giant mountains, and it's all one big circle, and behind the mountains is the sun, and on one half of the world the mountains are really tall, so when the sun travels behind those mountains it is nighttime, and then for half the day the sun travels out from behind those mountains and is on the shorter side of the mountains, and it's daytime. So obviously the flute player takes place in a world that's very, very different from our own, but at the same time it's a lot closer than the reader thinks. My influences have changed a lot since I wrote The Flute Player. Now some of my favorite authors include David Foster Wallace, Jonathan Franzen is probably my favorite living author, Don DeLillo, Jennifer Egan, even some John Hodgman. But when I wrote The Flute Player, which was actually about 5 years ago, maybe more like 6 now, I wrote it in high school. The first draft anyway, which was terrible, completely terrible. It was this cheesy love story, and it was about 10,000 words longer than it is now, and the message behind it was completely different and angsty, and it's changed a lot since I wrote that first draft. But when I did first write it, my influences, probably my biggest, was Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, C.S. Lewis, Philip Pullman. I had read Of Mice and Men only a couple years before I wrote The Flute Player, and I think John Steinbeck's ability to tell such a great story in such a short amount of space really influenced me when I wrote the first draft of The Flute Player, as I was almost uncomfortable with the idea of writing something so short, but reflecting on Of Mice and Men and how great it was helped me to realize that it was okay to write a novella, and that a novella could still be a complete and meaningful story. Let's see. I had read a little bit of Kafka by the time I wrote The Flute Player, The Metamorphosis. Yeah, that's about it there. Ovid and Homer. The Aeneid, the Iliad, the Odyssey. I studied Latin a lot when I was in high school, and I read those, and I actually read the Aeneid in the original Latin, translating it as I went along, and then after that I read it in English. But kind of the fantastical voyages of that inspired some of the interactions in The Flute Player and parts of the world that the Flute Player takes place in, especially the description in the initial opening prologue. What are my interests inside of writing? Well, I've written 2 books so far, and a collection of poetry, and they're all very, very different. The Flute Player has definitely a sort of fantasy feel to it. It's got very fantastical elements. My poetry has that too, but also mixed with realism. My second book is much more realistic and more grown up than the Flute Player. Although it does, once or twice, I include those sort of fantastical elements, so I guess I really enjoy writing a sort of surrealistic prose. I also love writing about technology, but I have not done that fiction-wise. I have done that from a more journalistic standpoint. When I originally majored in journalism, my focus was in consumer technology. I was born in San Diego, California, in 1990, and grew up there until I was 7, and then moved to Youngstown, Ohio, where I finished growing up. And I majored in journalism at Youngstown State University for a while before deciding that I wasn't that into it, but I was still into writing, so I really wanted to pursue a career in fiction writing. So I ended up leaving college and moving to Pittsburgh for a while. Now I'm back in Youngstown as I finish up preparations for the launch of the Flute Player and for the launch of my second book, Brand Changing Day. And then after that, we'll see what happens. My interest outside of writing, I love exercise. I love exercising. Do tons and tons and tons of body weight exercising. And the reason I really like to exercise is so I can go rock climbing or anything climbing. I love climbing. Whenever I go out, I always wear a backpack instead of a shoulder bag, just because it's a lot easier in a backpack to climb random things than it is in a shoulder bag. Absolutely love climbing. I am also a pretty big wine, beer, and whiskey enthusiast, and I think that comes from having spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh, big beer city. So I love trying different kinds of beers, microbrews, love learning about them, love learning about wine, especially really into Malbecs right now, and whiskey also. I am starting to learn music. I play the ukulele. That's all I play right now. But definitely interests me. I also, of course, read a ton, and I love film and comic books. Believe it or not, I think there's a lot of literary value in certain comic books and graphic novels and graphic authors, which reminds me of another one of my influences, Neil Gaiman, the author of The Sandman and American Gods and Coraline.